So I had a question for you about, we all know about the Koch brothers. You know, they are billionaires that made their money on fossil fuel extraction, and now they have spent the last several decades spending millions and millions of dollars with other fellow elite to sort of undermine regulations and laws throughout the country. But there's this recent scholarship done linking the ideological underpinning of their work to James Buchanan, who was a economist who gained prominence in the 50s in Virginia when they were thinking of a legal way to oppose Brown in Virginia, and they actually traced, you know, the original the original scholarship that he used to James Calhoun in the 1820s. So I wanted to see if you had any thoughts on and insight on, you know, one of the biggest problems the whole globe is facing today and how that relates back to slavery and the brutality of the founding of this country.
Well, first of all, thank you for that question. And as I'm sure you know, the man who may become the next U.S. Secretary of State just met with Kim in North Korea, we were just told. Mike Pompeo, of course, hails from Wichita and could fairly be called the Koch brothers man in Washington. Although it's fair to say that there have been tensions and contradictions, at least in 2016, between the Koch brothers and one Donald J. Trump, which is part of this whole phenomenon of a certain kind of elite dissatisfaction with Donald J. Trump. Now, you're referring to the work of the Duke University historian Nancy McLean, who tries to draw a parallel between these attacks on the public sector and the Koch brothers' attack on the public sector and government regulations. What's interesting is that when the United States was forced to move away from Jim Crow schools and school segregation, the Dixiecrats in places like Virginia, you may know, since you're close to Virginia, you know, they shut down the public schools in certain counties in Virginia, which deprived young black youth of 3, 4, 5 years of education, and then set up these so-called segregation academies, whereby there was this sort of united front amongst those defined as white, where they were able to provide subsidies for white kids to go to these segregation academies. And you should not see this as being apart from the, not only the attack on the public sector that has driven school teachers into the streets in West Virginia and Oklahoma, amongst other states, but also you should see this as an attempt to undermine the public sector more generally, which is what this tax cut bill of December 2017 was all about, so that now the Republicans in Congress can say, well, we have to cut programs because there's no money. That is to say, as one conservative once put it, to reduce the size of government to the point where you can strangle it in a bathtub, for example. And you could go further to make an argument that there's a lot of anger, just like there's a lot of anger towards black people, because in some ways we represent lost fortunes. There's a sort of anger at the US government, because after all, it was the US government that mandated that these fortunes should be taken without compensation. And a lot of the fury it's no accident that the Republicans are strongest in Dixie, strongest in the South, and a lot of this anger at the public sector and at the government, it seems to me, can be traced back at least till 1865, when the whole system of slavery was turned on its head and property was taken without compensation by the US government. And of course, the Dixiecrats would say it was taken without due process of law, which they would say is a violation of the US Constitution. That's what they would say.
And
Thank you.
okay.
I'm going to ask you to hold, our time is running, so I'm going to have to take the next question behind you. How much time do we have left? 20 minutes. Oh, okay, good.
Thank you for your work, Dr. Horne. I read Race to Revolution and Counter-Revolution in 1776 simultaneously at the behest of a friend of mine at Red Emma's. And I was locked in 100%. Thank you for coming to Red Emma's a short time back. My question is very, very visceral. and it pertains to what do you see as the tipping point of, let's use as an illustration, the cover of Counter-Revolution. Or, the cover, and it's got a bunch of black people killing a bunch of white people, okay? And I find myself with each indignity being pushed. I am a very peaceful person,
I hear you.
but I'm only peaceful with people who are peaceful with me. And I guess one of the things that really hit me hard, took me back to the Vietnam era, was this young man that immolated himself in Central Park a few days ago. Yeah. I would venture to say there are probably people in this audience that have thought about doing that. I just feel that we are at a tipping point. We are at the precipice of extreme ugliness, not just here, but throughout the planet. And I just wanted to get from you, do you think it's a number? Is it going to be a series of acts? Yeah, I'll leave it in your hands to answer that question.
Well, thank you. That's a very difficult question to answer, since I'm more accustomed to looking at the past more so than making a projection for the future. So let me struggle to try to respond and introduce a point that I've only mentioned in passing, but I think all of us need to think about more deeply. And that is that the tension between Washington and Moscow is escalating. The United States is talked about starting a trade war with China. John Bolton, the National Security Advisor, has suggested that he would like to see the Iranian regime overthrown before the end of 2019. And another interesting note, Japan and China had one of its highest level meetings in about a decade, just this past week, not least because Tokyo is upset because when Trump lifted tariffs against many steel tariffs that have been imposed on many of the so-called U.S. allies, he didn't lift them on Japan. And of course, a staple of Trump discourse, to the extent that you can pinpoint a discourse, has been anti-Tokyo bashing going back to the 1980s. And any sort of entente that's ongoing between Tokyo and Beijing could be as earth-shaking as the entente between Beijing and Washington in the early 1970s. I say all that to say that I think that in terms of trying to do an analysis of where this country is going, that we not only need to look at the domestic forces, not only because when you look at the domestic forces, sometimes you can become very pessimistic, but also because it's necessary to look at the international arena. And I would say particularly for black people, because that's been our saving grace, that's been our salvation historically, is the ability to organize on the global scale and organize forces internationally to put pressure on the United States. For example, the way Robeson did in 1950 when he helped to organize the We Charge Genocide petition, going to the United Nations and putting U.S. Jim Crow in the spotlight, which then is a material factor in forcing the United States to make an agonizing retreat from Jim Crow. I think in 1954 with Brown versus Board of Education and all the litigation that comes thereafter. So I think that's really the missing link with regard to our struggle. You're here in Baltimore, you should go out, what was it, Mount Hope Boulevard, and knock on their door and talk to the folks out there about reviving their international apparatus. I think that that's the missing link in our struggle, and certainly we need it because we don't need strong brothers like you, my man, talking about self-immolation.
Yeah. Thank you, Gerald. Yes, sir.
My name is Chris. So I have you're good. I can lean. Okay, cool. So I just had two really quick questions. My first question is, I have a drop in the large ocean of knowledge that you have, like very, very small drop. My first question is actually rather simple. How does one start the path of, I guess, enlightenment, so to say, about learning these issues? Like how does, not issues, I guess, but how do you, like, where does one begin? I know this is a strange question. Like, is it a matter of getting a degree? Like where do you start the educational process? If so, for example, if it's just reading certain books and understanding certain scholars, like how does one discern who can be trusted and who's fake news? Does that make sense?
Okay, Okay, so Chris, can you ask the other one,
Yeah, the other one's
just-
really
just
quick
put
as
them
well.
together and
So
he'll
you
respond.
said economically that colonization was an economic statement, and well, at least I don't know if you necessarily made that point, but that it was when people see certain property now walking around free, that there's some offense to that. I was wondering for the second question, how does that play out today? Like, what does it look like to say that we are still economic? I mean, is this as African Americans still economic property, and how does that? I could see obviously that you lost a truck ton of money back in the 1800s because your slaves are not walking free. But how does that, I guess, compare
Oh, I
to
see.
today?
Well, I mean, I think that's a factor. I think part of it's that previous factor that I mentioned, which is the so-called stain of slavery, the so-called stain of not being part of the human family. Just as if you eat a turkey sandwich or a roast beef sandwich, you don't have necessarily pangs of conscience because you see that as a normalized behavior. And so likewise, if you're abusing black people under slavery, that becomes a normalized behavior, particularly when it's not interrogated, when you go from slavery to non-slavery without any sort of no Truth and Reconciliation Commission, for example, or any sort of vehicle of that sort. Now, with regard to knowledge, I can't recall if on that video this was mentioned, but I can only speak about myself. Well, I'd strike that from the record. I guess I can speak about other people, but I will speak about myself. You know, I was a child laborer. I sold newspapers from the age of 6 or 7 years old because I was from this poor working class family in St. Louis. And because I was selling newspapers, I began to read newspapers at a very early age. And still, I still am a firm believer in reading newspapers. So in terms of self-knowledge, I mean, like, for example, I read New York Times, Wall Street Journal, USA Today, Houston Chronicle, LA Times, Financial Times of London, China Daily. And then on the internet, those are all hard copies. And then on the internet, of course, you know, Guardian of London, Mail and Guardian of South Africa, allafrica.com, aatimes.com, asiatimes.com. And then, of course, The Economist of London, which it styles itself as a British publication, but it's really, you could call it a right-wing Yankee publication. But it's interesting nonetheless. You know, Business Week, The New Yorker, People magazine, because I want to know what my students know. And that's what they read. And I mean, I could go on in this, you know, historical journals. So, but of course, that's just individualized. And of course, at least when I was growing up, there used to be this thing about study groups. I don't know if people still have study groups, where, you know, you pick some book and then you read it. You know, it could be a novel or history or something, and then you come together and share ideas about it. I found I'm not in any study groups now, but during its flourishing, I enjoyed study groups. I mean, I thought that they were very interesting to share ideas with different people about different novels and short stories, et cetera. And then, of course, the study group is sort of an arm of a political organization that turbocharges it, that supercharges it. And so that's really what I would recommend, finally.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Much respect to both brothers. My question.
Your name, sir?
Owusu Bandele.
Got you.
First, quick question. First is, could you say a little bit more in terms of the position of people of African descent in the War of 1812 as opposed to American Revolution in terms of their numbers? Were there any major battles where they actually large numbers on each side fighting against each other, and the lot of each, group after the war? And the second question is in terms of the importance of context. What are some of the pitfalls that someone like Glenn Beck, bringing out a lot of participation in terms of African Americans, but still building into the so-called American dream?
Glenn, you mean the former Fox News commentator?
Yeah,
Oh, I see.
yeah. He had a show my brother shared just recently in terms of participation of people of African descent in the American Revolution.
Oh, I see. Well, I mean, first of all, I mean, it's well established, and I've written it too, that by several orders of magnitude, the Africans, the Negroes, fought with London against the settlers because they thought that that was in their best interest because London was on a faster track towards abolition. And likewise, with regard to the War of 1812, not only do you have more Africans fighting under the Union Jack, and in the pivotal Battle of New Orleans, which I made mention to a few moments ago, and this is represented in my book, Negro Comrades of the Crown, which came out a few years ago, that I would say about 15 to 20% of the folks fighting under the Union Jack were black. And of course, you cannot say that about the white supremacists in the United States of America. So there has been a lot of work in that regard. I just don't think, I think that many of the historians, from their point of view, they feel that they're being sympathetic to black people if they point out, if they don't stress the fact that black people were fighting against the United States, because they say, you know, black people have enough problems without stressing and emphasizing how they were fighting against the United States. And, you know, I sort of understand that. But on the other hand, you know, these U.S. people, you know, they always go to these other countries and say, I remember during, you know, during the wars in the Balkans, after Tito passes away in the 90s, you know, these Yankee commentators are always saying, you know, you need to face your history, no matter how painful it might be, you know. Now, of course, you know, physician, heal thyself. I mean, you know, why don't you face your own history? But of course, they always find a reason not to face their own history, although they're always telling people to face their history. And, you know, it's the typical hypocrisy. Now, I'm not sure if I'm able to comment on Glenn Beck, perhaps.
That's fine.
Okay.
That's good. Thank you.
First, I'd like to also extend my greetings and my respect for both of you gentlemen. I'm also an elder born in 1939.
Oh, my goodness.
and also an author. And as an author, I don't want to get into my book because I didn't come here for that. I came here because I was stimulated by something you said in terms of what you'd like to dig into. And so my question, I'd like to make one quick statement about the compensation to the slaveholders for this property. Nobody talks about the compensation to the slaves for their period of servitude.
Hear, hear.
And so it's very, very important.
Hear, hear.
And my question would be, do you think that we have put enough emphasis on our history prior to 1619, 1620, especially the civilization that we gave to the world when we were in Europe? And how could we begin to merge that history with the youngsters so that they don't have to start off with a sense of inferiority by starting off saying, well, I'm a slave and I'm gonna pull myself up by my bootstraps and I don't have boots. You know, in other words, if we could bring some of the contributions of greatness beyond that period, maybe it could go back to the 7th century and move itself up and merge that with all the great scholars that have done the history since we've been here. Bring those two pieces together to give some sense of I don't want to use the word greatness, but, you know, self-pride and dignity without starting from the period of slavery.
Well, thank you. And as a person who was wandering through Black Classic Press just a few hours ago, if you want to find those sorts of texts, you can find them right here in Baltimore. Because I noticed in terms of the BCP catalog, there are a number of books in the vein that you were just.
I'm familiar. I'm just trying to figure out how we can collaborate, if I may, to try to enhance it. Because I'm very familiar with Paul. In fact, I approached him when I went in to do what I was going to do. But I want to know what kind of way we can, can we contribute, any of us contribute anything to stimulate your digging into.
Oh, I see. Well, as once was said, I've experienced more yesterdays than I'll experience tomorrows, I'm afraid. And, I'm back to the 1500s now. I'm already beginning to think about the 1400s. but I'm not sure if, how much, you know, how much longer I'll be around. So somebody else is going to have to pick up the baton. But I will say this on a practical level, and once again, this is not original to me, is that it would be quite useful to have Saturday schools, whereby, now of course, I'm sure that's subject to the complaint that, well, you know, you're overworking these kids. I mean, shouldn't you also be pressuring the K through 12 schools to play this role? I would say yes. But I think it also, as a stopgap measure, to have Saturday schools where this kind of knowledge can be imparted. And I would also say, too, where we could introduce our young people to the study of foreign languages at an early age. Because one of the things I find interesting, like studying slavery in Florida, for example, one of the reasons why the black people became so pivotal in Florida was because oftentimes they were the interlocutors. I mean, they spoke English, of course, and they spoke Native American languages, they spoke Spanish. And thinking about that, I'm not sure if we've maintained that tradition of being the interlocutors by being multilingual. And that's another issue that we could address in Saturday schools. But certainly, I applaud the point that you just made.
Okay, so this, okay,
Tracy.
so the young lady,
Oh, go ahead.
the young lady's going to be the last question for the evening, okay? We've got about 5 minutes, and we've got a cocktail reception, book signing. Oh, gosh, all that good stuff is going to happen after we finish this up, you know? Yes, sir.
Yes, well, welcome to Baltimore, Gerald. My name's Doug Colbert, and a long time ago, when Gerald was a much younger person, I had the pleasure of teaching with Gerald in 1981 at City College, and that was before he wrote most of his 36 novels or books. I don't know if he had written any at that point, but you certainly were a big influence on many of us and the students that we taught. And that leads to the question that I want to ask, which I think you've been answering in many different ways tonight. I'm still teaching. I teach at Maryland Law School. And I guess my question is the importance of education and the fact that so many of, not just our students, but so many people lack the history of our own country, much less the international history of the human rights movement, of the post-1945 doctrines that you hold so much faith and I do as well. So I really want your comments on whether education is where it really begins, that if more people understood the ugly history of this country and really understood how much violence has been done for 400 years, whether that would awaken the conscience of this country, whether that would tell our legislators and everyone who's in power that reparations is a must and that we must really rebuild to give people the future that the human rights movement has declared in so many different ways.
Well, thank you very much. And, you know, as an educator, as a person who makes a living as an educator and who writes books, hopefully with the idea that somebody might read them at some point, I would be the last person to denigrate the necessity for education. But as you probably know, W.B. Du Bois, when he was first starting out, he had this idea that if he could just get the facts out, that that would be enough to sway consciousness and sway minds. And then he came to the conclusion that, well, maybe not. And so I think, and I'm sure you would agree, we need not only education, but we need organization. We need the organizing of more unions at the workplace, unions to resist gentrification and push for rent control, student unions to push for tuition freezes and tuition rollbacks. One of the deficits, one of the many deficits we have in this country is not enough organization. And so I think that I mentioned a moment ago the idea of these study groups linked to organizing is a turbocharged phenomenon, and I would reiterate that point here.
And we had in New York, if you remember, the Marxist School, and people like yourself and Cornell West and many others came and taught classes there, and that was a big boost for many people. I just wonder if the Real News or a place like this, could open itself up evenings or something like that, so that there can be classes taught or people coming in and speaking truth to us.
Well, speaking of the Real News, I want to encourage everyone to support the Real News Network. To make where there are study groups every day on the air, and to make conversations like these possible. And I hope that you don't leave this space without signing up and becoming a member and donating at the Real News table, which is right outside to your right. Thank you very much.
And Doug, I was waving at you to say that someone from the Real News will come up and address that as we close out.
Dr. Horne and Dr. Coates, thank you for this humbling opportunity. I am very young, and as the gentleman said before, I only have a drop of knowledge compared to your large river of information that you have gained for yourself. So thank you for this, number one. My name is Jessica Goodman, and I come from a business perspective. How can young African Americans get the attention to themselves to just take back what we deserve and kind of incorporate that into the American society without threatening Americans in order to be ourselves? And that's the only question that I have. Thank you.
Well, obviously that's a very difficult and complicated question that you pose, but I'm thinking of the Starbucks episode in Philadelphia, where for business reasons, perhaps for humanitarian reasons, let us hope the latter, that Starbucks is going to be closing its stores, I think 8,000 of them on a day in May, and then engaging in a certain kind of education with regard to not seeing a person like yourself as a threat to be turned away, which is something that happens, as we know, on a daily, if not hourly or minute-by-minute basis in the United States for reasons we've already made reference to. And once again, I leave you, and I think it's an appropriate point to conclude with the 2 points, education and organization. And I'll leave you with that point, and thank you to Paul Coates, thank you to you for your attention, and thank you to the Real News.